Now it's time for our newspaper review and what's making headlines around the world. The lead story on Le Figaro looks at the first US-Africa summit starting in Washington on Monday. The spread of the deadly Ebola virus could overshadow President Obama's aims to develop economic partnerships.
Another story in the press, German businesses are cooling on Russian investments. This is in the Wall Street Journal. It reports anger over Russia's actions in Ukraine has led some companies to rekindle commercial ties with Iran.
Monday marks exactly 100 years since Britain entered the Great War. The Financial Times reports that the famous war still arouses conflicting feelings in Germany.
Obesity is threatening Asian health systems and economic growth, so says today's China Daily. It looks at Asia's obesity problem due largely to Western processed foods replacing traditional fresh food.
The personal data of millions of Britons, including financial history and criminal records, could be shared across British government agencies. According to the Daily Telegraph, a white paper proposal will be published in the autumn.
And a few of the UK papers have their covers that are dedicated to the closing ceremony at the Commonwealth Games in Glasgow. The Guardian questioning whether the positivity generated by the Games will affect Scotland's upcoming independence referendum.
Well, joining us is Mark Davies, CEO of Camberton Strategic Consultancy. And welcome to the programme,
Morning, Mark.
Good morning. Le Figaro leading with this US-Africa summit. Of course, Ebola likely to overshadow it, but I just wonder whether actually what's more on many people's minds, especially in the US, is whether it's all a little too late, given China's dominance of Africa.
Well, but yes, possibly. I mean, the growth numbers from the IMF for the next couple of years for Africa are quite good, and that's why, of course, the Americans are suddenly getting involved. But you're right, they are quite late to this party. President Obama last year went on a tour of 3 African nations, and he said at the time, I'm going to convene a big summit. It's the largest thing that's ever been done by a US president in terms of welcoming heads of states from Africa. And it's a shame from his perspective that, yes, Ebola is going to overshadow it to a large extent. A couple of heads of state can't go as a result of it. And obviously that's what's been making all the headlines rather than any kind of economic growth or progress.
But there are still opportunities there for the US.
Well, one would think so. I mean, he hasn't cancelled it. I suppose he wouldn't at short notice. But yes, I would hope so. Otherwise he wouldn't be involved.
Now let's have a look at the Wall Street Journal and its interesting article about German business cools on Russia, turns to Iran, and it's a story that you could read in a certain way, but then you could argue actually maybe Germany was looking at Iran anyway and would have been looking at Iran anyway, like many other European countries are in terms of business opportunity, and so it's not necessarily one replacing the other.
Well, the implication is that it's a little bit out of the frying pan into the fire here, because Russia, the amount of investment that Germany has in Russia is significant, and obviously there's been all the talk around the recent sanctions and the wish to impose them that Germany doesn't want to impose. So Germany, there are 6,200 Russian companies that have had German investment of some sort, 30 billion euros. So it's an enormous amount, and it has had a major impact on what they've been able to do. You think to yourself, okay, you go into Iran, this is a country which over recent years hasn't exactly been flavour of the month with the Western world. And if we were in a position where we wanted to start imposing any kind of sanctions there, for them to be heavily involved from trade from that point of view, again, it doesn't look great.
But it's certainly something that's dominated the press ever since the US engaged in discussions with Iran again, and it looked like, sanctions against Iran were likely to be lifted at some point in the future. Businesses across Europe have been, readying themselves for the opportunities that are there.
Yes, absolutely. I think this is making a story because of the extent to which the Russian situation has been forefront of people's minds, with Germany being a drag on the possible sanctions that might be imposed on Russia. And so it just makes a good story that now they're involved in Iran.
But as you say, plenty of risk in Iran.
Yeah, look, I think there's huge risk. It's only been in the last year or so, because of the general geopolitical situation, that people have looked to Iran and said maybe there's a solution here that Iran might represent. But it's only a year ago that Iran was very much the priority, probably less than that, with their nuclear ambitions. So yes, I would agree, Jane.
Just moving on to the Financial Times, and staying, I guess, with Germany, but looking really at the commemorations today marking Britain's entry into the war and really the start of World War One. But we're really focusing on German feelings about the commemorations, and it's a very interesting piece because it talks about how actually the First World War in Germany had not largely forgotten exactly, but clearly World War II had taken over, and lots of memories and so on have been overtaken really by that second conflict, but now they've been revived.
Well, I think it's more that there's been a debate here in this country about how we should commemorate the First World War, and we weren't seen to be the aggressor. Now, okay, there's a debate around that. If you look at Neil Ferguson against Max Hastings, they've written very different books about the First World War, whether we should have gone in or not. But generally, I think people in this country feel relatively comfortable about the fact that we fought. We were seen to fight for freedom. In Germany, there isn't that feeling. There is, and to some extent, it was their aggression that caused the First World War, and the Kaiser was saying to people, well, this will be all over by Christmas. And by Christmas, 1 million people had died. So I think for the Germans, it's a very difficult thing to look back on, whether they should do so with pride or just how they should look back on it. They just don't know how. So this story is about a war memorial that is a German war memorial, but it is in Belgium and it isn't visited by Germans. So it has far more visitors from France and from the UK than it does from Germany. It's just a function of the way that they have struggled to come to terms with their history, and you can understand why.
And those commemorations we'll be talking about here on BBC World News a little later.
Yes, indeed. There's a lot of coverage on that, and it's in a lot of newspapers today as well, obviously the commemoration. But let's now squeeze in other stories. This is quite an interesting one in the business section of China Daily, looking at processed food, a big fat problem. And the way they headline it, Westernization is bringing a host of obesity-caused woes in Asia. Like it's all our fault. We're imposing all these terrible habits on the vast majority of people in Asia. Tell us about this article. It's an interesting trend.
Well, some of the stats in this article are quite frightening. In the US, 9% of healthcare spend is on obesity issues. Now, it's nothing like that in Asia, but yes, Sally, as you say, they're starting to say, okay, we're eating more and more Western food, and we've got a growing obesity problem.
It's kind of fast food, isn't it? When we talk about Western food, it's
actually
processed fast food.
It's about lifestyle as a whole. Apparently, it's also about the extent to which they sit in front of computers and the way the world has become significantly Westernized. The big numbers are still from the Western countries. Actually, the numbers out of Australia are the most frightening. 19.3% of people in Australia are obese, according to this article, compared with, say, in India, where it's 0.3%. So, the numbers in Asia. People talk about first world problems, and obesity is a first world problem. So, in a way, you could argue the fact that it is moving into some Asian countries, it shows an improving lifestyle in some respects.
And more money to spend on food.
No processed food here this morning.
Not in the green room here. Definitely not. Let's take a look at the Daily Telegraph now. Beautiful picture of Kylie Minogue, I have to say, as she ended the Commonwealth Games. Talk about that in a minute. But this article is about Whitehall wants to share all our financial secrets. It's one of those stories that you read in the paper and a shiver just goes down your spine.
Well, it does.
About your personal information in the hands of civil servants and where it ends up. Left on a train.
Do you remember a few years ago when they lost that disc and a
so
record?
What's this about today?
And this is about the idea that different government departments should be able to share data. They think they can save £37 billion in fraud costs if they share data across
That's
departments.
A lot of money. That's
the
a big
one thing
figure.
that they're not going to share is health records. So I think people can take some comfort from that. But in terms of your financial history, your qualifications, what your property wealth is, that information will be shared. And as you say, Sarah, I think it does worry a little bit. Although there are some people who share a lot of information online, there are other people who fight shy of doing that. And here they're not going to get a choice. At least online you can decide if you're going to give your information up to people or not. Here, if government departments decide that they're going to share it, there's nothing that we're going to be able to do about it.
Quick final word about the Commonwealth Games. The Daily Telegraph calls it Golden Glory. The Guardian, Glasgow's glittering games. I just wonder whether, as I guess some people in Scotland are hoping, this will play into the independence debate.
Well, the big question is what next, isn't it? So there's the debate tomorrow that takes place between Alex Salmond and Alistair Darling. Alex Salmond had a self-imposed ban during the course of the 11 days of the game in terms of talking about independence, and now that's going to hit
wasn't it?
the agenda again. Yes, it certainly was. It was fantastic, the games. It took a little bit of time to get into it, but by the end I was loving it.
Mark, many thanks. Mark Davies, thanks for joining us here this morning with that look at the papers.
And thank you too for your company. Have a lovely day. We'll see you soon. Bye-bye.